As the 20th century began, the automobile was transforming the oil industry. Gasoline-powered vehicles promised to more than make up for the declining use of petroleum in kerosene production. Between 1900 and 1910, almost 500,000 cars took to America's roads. It was clear that new sources of petroleum would have to be found. Men began looking for the black gold in the most unlikely areas. One of these areas was Texas. The first gusher of Texas crude exploded from the ground on January 10, 1901. It was the largest strike in history, and it was a culmination of 2 years of struggle by a new breed of oilmen called wildcatters. It also marked the beginning of the end for Standard Oil's domination of the oil industry. The company now had to compete with thousands of oilmen, probing and drilling the earth in search of oil. The stereotypical wildcatter was a man with little education who had a singular desire to strike it rich in oil. One such man was a one-armed merchant and Sunday school teacher named Patillo Higgins. Higgins was convinced that oil could be found at a site near Beaumont, Texas. On a small hill called Spindletop, flammable gas bubbled out of springs. Higgins felt that the gas was a sure indication of oil. However, practically everyone associated with the oil industry knew that oil fields were chiefly an eastern phenomenon. Expert geologists proclaimed the notion of oil in Beaumont ridiculous. Townspeople began to think that Higgins might be insane. All the experts agreed that Texas would never develop as a major oil-producing region.
In the late 19th century, the oil industry in the United States was primarily concentrated in a belt of states that surround the Great Lakes. Pennsylvania was, of course, where oil was first discovered in America. By the turn of the century, Ohio is the largest oil-producing state. The state of Texas, by comparison, is a relatively minor player.
In a desperate attempt to prove his theory, Higgins took out an ad for a professional driller. Only one, Anthony F. Lucas, a salt and sulfur driller by trade, responded. After listening to the Higgins story and examining the site for himself, Lucas became convinced that Higgins was not as crazy as people thought. Lucas and Higgins appealed to Standard Oil for help, but were summarily rejected. Desperate for funds, they then turned to the Pittsburgh-based wildcat firm of James Guffey and John Galley. The firm was financed by the Mellon family, who were among the nation's leading bankers.
Higgins had no money. He'd become a bit of a joke in Beaumont. Nobody was willing to put any money into anything that he put together any longer. Lucas started looking for more money, and a deal was worked out. Guffey and Galley would find the money. As it turns out, they went to the Mellon banking house, and the Mellon brothers gave a small percentage to Lucas, and they said nothing for Higgins. If Lucas wanted to share with Higgins, he could, out of the generosity of his heart, but they weren't willing to make a deal that would include Patillo Higgins.
Pushing Higgins aside, Lucas started drilling in the fall of 1900. After drilling down almost 900 feet, a trickle of oil bubbled to the surface. One of the experienced drillers on the crew speculated that the well might eventually produce 50 barrels a day. Most of the other drillers felt that this estimate was overly optimistic. Drilling continued into January. Each day, new pipe was added as the drill bored deeper and deeper into the Texas earth. On the 10th day of the new year, Spindletop began to shake. Then it erupted.
Spindletop is like no other oil find anywhere. It doubles the total U.S. production of oil by itself. It alone represents 1/5 of the oil supply of the world at that time. There is a lake of oil before they can shut down the gusher that is a mile long.
Land which had sold for $10 an acre a year before now went for $1 million an acre. Beaumont instantly became a boom town. Almost overnight, the city's population grew from 10,000 to 50,000. An additional 16,000 people crammed into tents on Spindletop itself. Many of those who arrived in Spindletop were from the rougher elements of society.
It was said that half the whiskey consumed in Texas was drunk in Beaumont. Gambling houses were very popular. Gambling was popular, and so was fighting. And usually not a night went by that there weren't 2 or 3 murders. And one morning, the people in Beaumont woke up and 16 bodies were dragged from the river, all with their throats slit.
But it was not only the worst elements of society that came to Beaumont. The prostitutes, swindlers, and thieves who descended on East Texas mingled with some of America's wealthiest families. Members of the Mellon clan made frequent visits to check on their investment at Spindletop. When it became clear that James Guffey lacked skill as a manager, the Mellons got nervous. Recognizing the incredible value of their investment in the Texas wilderness, Andrew Mellon offered to sell the family's interest in Spindletop to Standard Oil. In one of the greatest errors in the company's history, Standard Oil rejected the offer. Andrew Mellon immediately sent his younger brother William to take over management from Guffey. Using the family's vast resources, William resolved to build an oil company that could compete with the colossus known as Standard. With Spindletop producing 3,000 barrels of oil in an hour and oil storage capacity limited, the Mellons' first challenge was getting the oil quickly to market. William then ordered construction of a 450-mile pipeline linking the Mellon oil fields to the family's refinery at Port Arthur on the Gulf Coast. The oil could now be transported to markets around the globe. The company William built was to become known throughout the world as Gulf Oil. But Gulf was not the only new company to emerge from the Spindletop gusher. After hearing about the Spindletop find, a former Standard Oil pipeline supervisor and wildcatter named Joe Culligan came to Beaumont and quickly organized the Texas Fuel Oil Company. By 1905, Culligan had acquired a number of production sites in the Beaumont area and had purchased 4 large oil tankers to transport his petroleum. He renamed his company Texaco.
The size of the Spindletop discovery meant the whole oil industry was going to change. We were already moving in a direction away from the Standard Oil monopoly prior to the discovery of Spindletop, but Spindletop certainly accelerated that. When this field came in, all kinds of new oil companies developed out of it. And the 2 biggest ones that come directly out of Spindletop were Gulf Oil and Texaco.
By 1910, Texas-based oil companies were starting to compete for markets throughout the country. The once invincible Standard Oil began to show cracks. In 1911, those cracks burst. On January 6th, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the Standard Oil Trust was in violation of federal laws which prohibited the restraint of trade. Chief Justice Edward White ruled that Standard Oil would have to be broken up.
The breakup of Standard Oil transformed the oil industry in very short order. from essentially a one-company industry, at least in the United States, to one of the most competitive industries around.
Mobil, Chevron, Exxon, we're all Standard Oil company breakup. You've got Shell, BP, who are not, Texaco, who are not. But you're looking at the majority of the privately owned oil companies in the world were Standard Oil spinoffs.
The new companies that resulted from Standard's breakup and those that emerged from the Texas oil fields would fiercely compete with each other in the decades to come. Their competition was to transform the very nature of American life.